In 2021, a hedge fund manager named Bill Huang controlled roughly $20 billion in personal wealth, almost entirely built from stock positions he never sold. Not because he loved paying taxes on paper, because he'd figured out something most people never learn, and then took it so far, it eventually destroyed him. He borrowed against his stock instead of selling it, again and again, stacking leverage on top of unrealized gains until a handful of banks had quietly financed a fortune bigger than the GDP of some countries, all of it paper wealth he'd never actually cashed out. Then, in March 2021, over about 72 hours, the whole thing unwound. Banks issued margin calls he couldn't meet. Forced sales cascaded through the market. Roughly $20 billion evaporated faster than almost any personal fortune in modern history. I'm opening with the disaster on purpose, because the strategy that built his empire and the strategy that destroyed it are the same strategy. The technique wasn't reckless. What he did with it was. Almost nobody explains this clearly. The wealthiest people in the world rarely sell their biggest assets to get cash. Jeff Bezos didn't fund most of his lifestyle for years by selling Amazon stock. Elon Musk didn't sell Tesla shares to buy Twitter. He borrowed against them tens of billions of dollars, using the shares as collateral instead of liquidating them. This isn't a loophole three guys discovered. It's how debt and taxes interact in the American financial system, and it's available at a smaller scale to regular investors with a taxable brokerage account, most of whom have never even heard of it. My name is Tom, and I read SEC filings and IRS revenue rulings for fun, which is either the most boring hobby imaginable or the only one that actually explains why some people's net worth grows for decades while their visible spending never seems to touch it. If you've ever wondered how someone can be worth 9 figures on paper and still somehow not have cash, this video is for you. We're going to cover the exact mechanism the ultra-wealthy use to access cash without triggering the tax bill that comes from selling. The real math on why borrowing against appreciated assets can beat selling them, sometimes by a staggering margin. The single tax provision that turns this from a clever trick into a multi-generational wealth transfer machine. And the point where this strategy turns from smart into catastrophic, using Bill Huang as the warning. Leverage doesn't distinguish between a genius and an amateur. It only cares whether the collateral holds. This isn't a get-rich-quick video, and it's not a suggestion to max out margin on your brokerage account tomorrow. Most personal finance content skips this entirely, because most personal finance content is written for people who don't have appreciated assets yet. By the end of this one, you will understand the piece they leave out. Quick thing before we get into it. I put together a free calculator that models the actual after-tax outcome of selling an appreciated asset versus borrowing against it using real capital gains brackets and current lending rates instead of some oversimplified rule of thumb. Links in the description. I only asked for an email so I can send you the results. Picture your investment portfolio as an orchard you planted 20 years ago. Every tree is years of patience. Every season it produces more fruit than the last. Now say you need cash. Most people's instinct is to cut down a tree and sell the lumber. You get your cash. But that tree is gone for good. It will never produce fruit again. And you paid the lumber mill a steep fee for the privilege of destroying something that was still growing. The other option is walking into a bank and saying, "This whole orchard is worth a fortune, and it's still producing fruit every year. Lend me some cash against it." The bank says yes, because the orchard isn't going anywhere, and you walk out with cash in hand while every tree stays standing, growing, producing. That's the whole difference between selling and borrowing in one image. Selling permanently shrinks the orchard. Borrowing rents against its value while leaving every tree intact. Now put real numbers on it, because the gap here isn't small. Say you bought $200,000 of stock a long time ago, and it's now worth $1 million. That's an $800,000 unrealized gain. You need $300,000 in cash, maybe for a business opportunity, maybe for real estate. It doesn't matter why. Option 1, sell $300,000 worth of shares, because your cost basis is spread proportionally. Roughly $240,000 of that counts as gain, taxed at the long-term capital gains rate. Depending on your income, that's 15 to 20% federally, plus the 3.8% net investment income tax if you're above the threshold, plus state tax, which in a place like California can tack on another 13%. Stack the worst case, and you're looking at a combined bite approaching 35 to 37% of the gain. On $240,000 of gain, that's over $80,000 gone to the IRS the moment you sell. You wanted $300,000. You had to sell closer to $340,000 or more just to net that after tax, and you've permanently shrunk your compounding base by that much forever. Option 2, take out a securities-based line of credit against the same portfolio using the shares as collateral without selling a single one. Banks and brokerages routinely lend against diversified stock portfolios at somewhere between 50 and 70% of the portfolio's value, so on a $1 million portfolio, you could plausibly borrow $300,000 without touching a share. The interest rate is usually a short-term reference rate plus a spread, often landing somewhere in the 6 to 8% range in a normal environment. That sounds expensive until you remember what you're actually comparing it to, not zero. The 35+% you'd have paid in taxes to raise the same cash by selling. And borrowing isn't a taxable event. The IRS has never once treated a loan as income, no matter how large or how wealthy the borrower, because a loan has to be paid back. Meanwhile, your whole $1 million portfolio stays invested, stays compounding, keeps working as if you'd never touched it. Here's where the math gets almost unfair. If your portfolio keeps compounding at even a conservative 7% a year and your loan interest is running around 7% too, the growth on your assets roughly offsets the cost of the debt. You've accessed real cash today for close to free in present value terms, while a person who sold instead permanently shrank their compounding base twice over. Once by the cash withdrawn, once by the tax paid on top of it. Run that forward 20 years, and the two households aren't in the same universe financially, despite starting with the identical portfolio and the identical cash need. A second mechanism turns this from a clever cash flow trick into one of the most criticized wealth transfer tools in the tax code: step up in basis at death. When someone dies holding appreciated assets, the cost basis resets for tax purposes to the value on the date of death. That $800,000 unrealized gain from earlier, the one that would have triggered a massive tax bill if sold during the owner's lifetime, simply disappears for tax purposes the moment the owner dies and the assets pass to their heirs. The heirs inherit the stock at its current market value as the new basis. If they sell right away, there's little to no capital gains tax owed on gains that took decades to build. Put those two pieces together and you get what insiders call buy, borrow, die. You buy appreciating assets. You borrow against them instead of selling whenever you need cash, avoiding capital gains tax entirely during your lifetime. And when you die, the step-up in basis erases the tax on all that growth before it passes to your heirs, who can sell with a clean slate if they want. The original investor never paid capital gains tax on a dollar of it, not once. Entirely legal, entirely within the tax code as written. This is why proposals to cap or eliminate step-up in basis or to tax unrealized gains at death keep resurfacing in tax policy debates. Lawmakers on both sides have recognized this loophole moves an enormous amount of wealth across generations completely untaxed. This isn't a fringe insight either. A 2021 ProPublica investigation using leaked IRS data showed that a group of the wealthiest Americans paid remarkably little in federal income tax relative to how much their net worth grew during the same years, because so much of that growth sat unrealized in stock they never sold, while their lifestyles were funded by borrowing against those same holdings. The report set off immediate political attention. Lawmakers floated proposals to tax unrealized gains annually for the ultra-wealthy, and separate proposals to eliminate step-up in basis or cap how much gain can pass tax-free to heirs. None of it has become law, largely because taxing unrealized gains raises hard questions. How do you value a private business or an illiquid asset every year? What happens when the market drops the year after someone paid tax on a gain that then evaporates? Is it even constitutional to tax a gain that hasn't been realized in cash? But the fact that policy keeps circling this exact mechanism tells you how significant it is at scale. This isn't an obscure accounting trick affecting a handful of eccentric billionaires. It's structural enough that changing it has become a recurring line item in national tax debates. It helps to understand why the gap exists in the first place, because it isn't an oversight. It's the product of a very old and, on its own terms, reasonable principle. The realization requirement. Since the earliest days of the modern income tax, gains have generally only been taxed when they're realized, meaning converted into cash or another asset through a sale, rather than merely existing on paper. That logic holds up in isolation. Taxing someone on a gain they haven't actually received in spendable form creates real problems. What if the stock has already dropped by the time the tax bill is due? What if the asset is a family farm or a private business with no ready market to sell a slice of? The realization requirement was built to solve those problems. What its architects likely didn't anticipate was that decades later, a sophisticated lending market would emerge specifically to let people access the economic value of unrealized gains, real spendable cash, without ever triggering the sale the tax code was waiting for. The rule still makes sense for the problem it was built to solve. It just happens to leave a very large door open for anyone who understands it. This strategy is common knowledge in family offices and almost unknown to the average investor, and that's not an accident. The financial advice industry that reaches most households runs on a completely different incentive structure. Advisors managing modest accounts get paid directly or indirectly when clients trade, when clients need products, when clients have events. A strategy built around never selling, quietly borrowing instead, and holding for decades doesn't generate the kind of activity a transactional advisory relationship monetizes well. Private banks and family offices serving ultra-high net worth clients work the opposite way. They profit from lending against assets, from managing the credit facility itself, so their incentives line up perfectly with teaching clients this exact strategy. The information isn't secret because it's complicated. It's obscure because the part of the industry that reaches regular people has no reason to teach it. And the part that does teach it only serves clients most people will never meet. There's a psychological layer to this too. Most people have been trained correctly to fear debt. Credit card debt at 24% funding a depreciating lifestyle is dangerous, and most financial advice is right to warn people off it. But that correct lesson gets flattened into all debt is bad, which pushes people to reflexively sell appreciating assets instead of considering low-cost debt against those same assets, even when the math clearly favors borrowing. Debt that funds consumption on a depreciating asset and debt that unlocks liquidity against an appreciating one are nearly opposite tools wearing the same word. Mixing them up is one of the most expensive category errors in personal finance, and it's an easy one to make because almost nobody draws the line clearly. I know a small business owner, we'll call him Dave. He built a substantial position in his company's stock over 15 years of employee purchases and vesting, worth around $2 million by the time he wanted to buy a second property to expand his business. His instinct, like almost everyone's, was to sell $400,000 of stock. He mentioned it to his accountant almost in passing, expecting a shrug. Instead, his accountant asked a simple question. Why sell an asset that's still growing to buy another asset that's going to grow, when you could just borrow against the first one instead? Dave hadn't considered it, mostly because nobody in his life had ever framed it as a real option. He'd grown up with the same instinct most people have, that debt is something you take on reluctantly, as a last resort, not something you choose deliberately over a cash sale you could easily afford. His accountant walked him through the numbers, roughly $110,000 in combined federal and state capital gains tax on the sale versus the interest cost of borrowing instead. It wasn't close. Dave opened a securities-based line of credit against his brokerage account, a process that took less than 2 weeks and required no new underwriting beyond the value of the pledged shares, borrowed $400,000 at roughly 7%, used it to buy the property outright, and kept his original stock position untouched, still fully invested, the same as it had been the day before. Over the next 6 years, his stock portfolio kept growing by more than the interest he paid, and the new property appreciated and started generating rental income that more than covered the loan payments on its own. So the second asset ended up funding the debt used to acquire it, while the first asset kept compounding undisturbed in the background. He never triggered a capital gains event. He never gave up a single share. 2 assets growing at once, funded by leverage against the first instead of a sale. And by year 6, the combined value of both, minus the remaining loan balance, was clearly higher than if he just sold the stock outright, purely because of the tax bill he never paid and the shares that never stopped compounding. Now the other side, because this strategy has real teeth when it's mishandled, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. A different guy, we'll call him Ray, saw the same math we just walked through, watched a few videos, read some forum threads about billionaires never paying taxes, and took it much further than any family office risk manager would sign off on. Instead of borrowing conservatively against a diversified portfolio, he concentrated heavily in a handful of volatile growth stocks and then borrowed aggressively against that concentrated position, close to the maximum his brokerage allowed to buy even more of the same stocks. A liquidity tool turned into a leverage-on-leverage bet. For about 18 months, it worked beautifully. The stocks climbed, his net worth multiplied several times over on paper, and he felt like he'd cracked the billionaires' code, except better, because he was compounding the borrowed money into more of the winning position instead of just sitting on it. He started telling friends about it. He believed he'd found a shortcut nobody else had noticed. Then one of his core holdings dropped nearly 40% in 6 weeks, a disappointing earnings report combined with a broader tech sell-off that hit the whole sector at once. The kind of correlated drop diversification exists to protect against, and that concentration guarantees you'll feel at full force. Because his collateral was concentrated, its value didn't dip, it collapsed all at once, and his brokerage issued a margin call. Deposit more cash within days, or have shares sold automatically to cover the shortfall, regardless of what price the market happened to be offering that morning. He didn't have idle cash sitting around, because all of it was deployed in more stock, which had felt so efficient 18 months earlier and now left him nothing to pull. The brokerage force sold his position at the worst possible moment, at the bottom, locking in losses on shares he'd never intended to sell in the first place, to repay a loan he'd taken out to avoid selling in the first place. The stock partially recovered over the following year. His shares, the ones force liquidated during the margin call, didn't recover at all because they weren't his anymore. They belonged to whoever bought them the day the brokerage was forced to dump them at a discount. This is Bill Hwang's disaster in miniature, tens of thousands of dollars instead of tens of billions. But the same mechanism and the same failure point. Concentration plus leverage plus a correlated drop equals forced selling at the worst possible moment, which defeats the whole point of borrowing instead of selling. This is the part almost never mentioned in the breathless online explainers about how billionaires avoid taxes. Borrowing against assets only works as long as the collateral holds its value comfortably above the loan balance. The moment markets get volatile and your collateral drops sharply, especially if you're concentrated or borrowed close to the maximum your lender allows. The same tool that lets you avoid a voluntary planned sale can force an involuntary, badly timed one instead, on terms you don't control, at a moment you didn't choose. Billionaires who use this successfully over long periods share a common trait the headlines leave out. They borrow conservatively, well below the maximum available, against diversified holdings, so that ordinary volatility can't come close to triggering a margin call. The strategy isn't dangerous by nature. It becomes dangerous the moment someone treats a risk management tool like a growth accelerator and stops respecting the collateral cushion underneath it. This isn't a strategy for everyone, and pretending it is would be irresponsible. If your entire net worth sits in a retirement account, borrowing against it typically isn't even an option and shouldn't be attempted through workarounds. Retirement accounts carry their own rules and penalties for good reason. This lives in taxable brokerage accounts, holding appreciated assets you weren't planning to sell soon anyway, where the alternative on the table is a voluntary sale that would trigger a real tax bill. It also assumes you have the discipline to treat the borrowed amount as an actual loan that gets serviced or repaid, not free money that showed up out of nowhere. People who forget it's debt end up like Ray. Here's the protocol. 5 rules if you're going to consider this at all. Rule 1. Never borrow against a concentrated position. If your collateral is 1 or 2 stocks instead of a real diversified portfolio, a single bad earnings report can wipe out the cushion protecting you from a margin call. Diversification isn't just a growth strategy here. It's the safety mechanism that makes borrowing against assets survivable through a downturn. Rule 2. Borrow well under the maximum your lender offers, nowhere close to it. If a brokerage will lend you 65% of your portfolio's value, treat 30 to 40% as your real ceiling. The gap between what you borrow and what you're allowed to borrow is your entire buffer against a drop. And that buffer is the difference between weathering a correction and getting force liquidated during one. Rule 3. Only use this against assets you were already planning to hold long term. It's not a tool for funding lifestyle spending you couldn't otherwise afford. It's a tool for accessing liquidity from wealth you already intended to keep invested for decades. If you wouldn't be comfortable holding the underlying asset through a 30 or 40% drawdown without panicking, don't borrow against it either. Rule 4. Understand and monitor the interest rate exposure. Many of these loans carry variable rates tied to short-term benchmarks, so your cost of borrowing can rise significantly if rates climb, similar to what happened to homeowners with adjustable rate mortgages when rates rose recently. Know whether your rate is fixed or floating, and check whether you could still comfortably service the loan if the rate rose 2 or 3 points from where it started. Rule 5. Keep a real cash buffer outside the pledged portfolio so you can cover loan payments or add collateral during a downturn without reacting in a panic. The investors who make it through market crashes with this strategy intact are never the ones scrambling for cash the day a margin call notice arrives. They're the ones who built the buffer in calmly, months or years earlier, because they assumed a bad stretch would eventually come, not because they knew when. Selling an appreciated asset isn't inherently wrong. Sometimes it's the right move, especially if a position has gotten too concentrated, or you need the money with no responsible alternative, or you just don't have the temperament to carry debt comfortably, which is a perfectly legitimate reason to skip this strategy entirely, no matter how good the math looks on paper. But most people never even get the chance to make that choice deliberately because they don't know borrowing against appreciated assets is a real, mainstream, entirely legal alternative that professional investors and family offices use constantly. They sell by default, not by decision, because nobody ever told them there was a second door in the room. Understanding this mechanism doesn't require you to use it. It requires you to stop being blind to an entire category of decision-making that shapes an enormous share of real wealth accumulation at the top of the income distribution and increasingly at the upper end of the middle class too, as more people build meaningful positions in taxable brokerage accounts through employer stock and long-term index investing. The knowledge itself is the asset here. What you do with it depends on your own risk tolerance, your own collateral, and your own discipline, none of which a video can assess for you. 3 takeaways. 1. Selling an appreciated asset and borrowing against it are not financially equivalent. The tax treatment alone can create a gap of tens of thousands of dollars on a single transaction, and that gap compounds over the decades the asset would have kept growing. 2. Step up in basis at death is what makes this strategy generational rather than just tactical, turning a lifetime of deferred capital gains into gains that may never get taxed at all if held until death and passed to heirs. 3. Leverage against appreciated assets is a risk management tool, not a growth accelerator. And the moment you treat it like the second thing, you're one bad earnings report away from becoming a much smaller version of Bill Hwang. Lazy investing built more fortune than clever borrowing tricks ever will on their own. This strategy works because it protects a portfolio that was already built the boring way, patiently and diversified, held for decades. Borrowing against nothing is just debt. Borrowing against a fortune you already built the right way is a tool. If you want to see the actual structure of a securities-based line of credit, the real terms, the real rates, and how the paperwork compares to a traditional loan, there's a breakdown on my channel walking through the exact documents, no guesswork, just the real numbers. Building wealth slowly. Think independently.